Welcome. Here we're going to be talking about what I'm calling the foundations of American government, uh, classical liberalism, elitism versus pluralism, citizen engagement, and a tradition of inegalitarianism. All right. Now, each of those four topics I'm going to walk through in subsequent slides. Overview here: classical liberalism, a set of ideas handed down to us by what's called the 18th Century Enlightenment Project, things that sort of are a core part of our political culture, things that we believe as a people. All right. We're going to cover elitism versus pluralism. Our book does a nice job of that in chapter 1. Oh, by the way, our book does cover classical liberalism, but it covers it more in chapter 2. So you'll see that pop up again in chapter 2. I also like to have it here as a foundational part of our politics. Anyway, elitism versus pluralism, right? The distribution of power. Elitism argues it's distributed at the top. Pluralism says no, it's more decentralized to we the people via organized groups. We're going to talk about citizen engagement, right? Core to what it means to be a citizen in a democracy is right. We are active shapers of our own destiny, not subjects but citizens. Governing ourselves, however imperfectly, different ways to achieve that engagement. And then finally, we'll talk about, unfortunately and really tragically, America's genuine tradition of inegalitarianism. That won't shock anybody, right? Every country is going to have its own unique version of this inegalitarianism. We have the American version, right? Beginning most obviously with our original sin, the institution of slavery. But that's really shot throughout our history. And in some ways, right, we've been trying to come to terms with that ever since. All right, so the first element of our foundations section here is going to be classical liberalism. Basically a set of ideas handed down to us from a project called the 18th Century Enlightenment. Although some of those thinkers actually go far back as the 1600s, people like Thomas Hobbes and even John Locke. But it's called, for whatever reason, the 18th Century Enlightenment, although some of it's 17th century. All right, so what are those ideas that influence us yet today and were foundational to our founding? This idea of competitive individualism and human reason. All right, let's break that down a little bit. Competitive individualism is the idea, number one, that the individual matters a very great deal. Government has to take the individual very seriously. Historically, that wasn't the case, by the way. For most of human history, individuals didn't really matter. The only thing that mattered were a small group of elites. Right? So this is a revolution in that thinking. Ordinary individuals matter a very great deal. They're front and center of our politics. Right? Government has all sorts of obligations to ordinary people. And individuals are very competitive with one another, right? Very competitive. Now look, let me distinguish here between the competitive vision of a Thomas Hobbes and his magnum opus, Leviathan. He said, in the state of nature, in the absence of government, life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. He has a dark vision for the state of nature. Right? They were always trying to murder each other, basically. And he said, well, since the problem of the state of nature is extreme, we need to enter into a social contract in which we create a government that is very powerful, that he called Leviathan, monstrously large, right, to restrain people's murderous impulses. Ooh, that's a lot to take. John Locke comes along a little later and goes, calm down, cool your jets, Tommy boy. The state of nature is problematic, but it's problematic. It's not catastrophic. People are a bit selfish, right, a bit biased in favor of their own point of view, their own interests. And that's problematic. You can't resolve disputes in a fair and equitable way under that condition of the state of nature. So we do enter into a social contract with one another to create a government, but that is a government of limited power. We'll get to that in a moment. That is a government of limited power to solve a limited problem of an inconvenient state of nature. It's not catastrophic. So we've gone right down John Locke's road, thankfully, and not the road sketched out by Thomas Hobbes. So that's the idea there of competitive individualism. And then human reason, right? Human reason and rationality over faith. Throughout most of human history, faith in religious entities and a belief in sort of mythology and superstition and the idea of witches and gods on Mount Olympus and all of that, right? That was most of human history. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, right, there's a growing sense here that that's not the way forward. That's not the way to achieve progress, that we have to make better sense of the world around us, both the natural world and the political world. We need to apply human reason and rationality, not faith and superstition and mythology. Right? There's still room for religion and faith under this approach, right? But it becomes less central and more marginal, quite honestly. Now, if you want to look at why we are becoming today in the Western Hemisphere more and more secular and less religious, the roots are here, quite honestly. All right, science, if you will, over religion. Number 2, how to organize the economy. 2 related ideas: relatively free markets and private property. Relatively free markets. That comes to us from a guy by the name of Adam Smith. His magnum opus was published in the year 1776, interestingly enough, and it was called The Wealth of Nations, in which he argued that we should organize our economy using relatively free markets. He was arguing not against socialism, which wasn't even a thing back then. He was arguing against mercantilism, right? The tendency for countries to implement trade policies that were selfish and oriented towards helping your country and hurting every other country. Mercantilism, right? Put tariffs on imports to limit imports to protect your home industry. Quotas on imports to protect your home industry. Subsidies for exports to make it easier to export goods and services across the globe to produce a positive balance of trade for that country. Right? But the problem is, right, if every country across the globe does that, it becomes super problematic. It starts to impede global trade. So Adam Smith said, don't do it, right? Politically, it's tempting, right? Your own people are going to tell you, we want mercantilism. We want you to protect us at the expense of people in other countries. Even today, right, that's a real thing across the globe. But he argued against that and said, no, that impedes global trade and it impoverishes everybody, right? The wealth of nations comes from global free trade, not mercantilism. So we've taken that to heart, haven't we? Maybe more so than any other country in the world today. Relatively free markets is the way to organize our economy, certainly domestically. And, you know, look, do we still have mercantilist policies just like every other country? Sure. But, you know, the idea is we try to minimize that. And then Smith also argued, look, free markets channel selfish behavior by the individual, right, the desire to get ahead in the world economically. It channels that energy in ways that are economically productive and produce tremendous economic growth. And those benefits trickle down to everybody to at least some degree, you know, without being naive about it. You know, to at least some degree, it trickles down to everybody. And that's how you create a wealthy society, right? The invisible hand of the market channels individual selfishness into larger benefits for the country as a whole, right? How can we afford a decently large welfare state today here in America? Because we have a productive economy. All right. And then as well, right, the linked issue of private property. Super central for a country that wants to have a good economy to protect private property, right? Because if a government doesn't protect private property, why would individuals invest their labor into their property if they can't keep most of the benefits of that labor? Right? If you put all your work into an acre of land growing crops one year, and then other people move in at the end and steal all your crops, and that's okay, right? That reduces your incentive to do that the next year. So how do you incentivize people to work hard? Protect private property, right? And Locke goes further and says, boy, private property is so central that it's one of those fundamental rights that we possess by dint of our Creator, right? That we are endowed by our Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. That's how central it is. And if government doesn't adequately protect it, we have the right to revolution and rebellion. Maybe bloody, hopefully not, but probably more nonviolent through elections in which we get rid of one government that's failed to protect property and create, right, put into place a government that will protect it. Number 3, what is classical liberalism? Limited government, right? Limited government. You do want the economy to be organized mostly in a free market way that puts most of the economic power in private hands, not the government's hands. Right? Limited government. Look, we have a regulatory government that does regulate the market, right? And we do have a government that has a welfare state to help we the people from falling through the cracks. Right? But you try to limit that government as much as is feasible, and that's a matter for contest. Right? But limited government. You don't want government to be too powerful. You don't want any institution to be too powerful. You don't want corporations to be too powerful, but you also don't want the government to be too powerful. You want it to be powerful enough to get things done, right, and do good things for we the people. But you also want to limit that power. And then finally, and very broadly, right, classical liberalism, not to be confused with, Joe Biden is a liberal and that kind of thing. But classical liberalism, values that we all share, albeit we all have our own version of exactly what it is. Optimism about the future, right? That if we have competitive individualism and we use our human reason and we have relatively free markets and we protect private property and we have limited government, if all those things are in place, we will achieve tremendous progress over time on into the indefinite future. Right? The idea that in general we make progress over time if we adhere to these values and institutions that we've just talked about. So in talking about the foundations of American politics, American government, right, clearly one needs to talk about classical liberalism. Let me also note, right, that classical liberalism, that material is effectively covered in Chapter 2 of our text. So we'll be revisiting this in the next module as we talk about some of the influences on the Founding Fathers, i.e. the 18th century Enlightenment, right, that produces this thing that today we call classical liberalism, right, a shaping force in our politics. But also, right, we want to talk about some other things captured in Chapter 1 of our text, notably here, this debate of elitism versus pluralism, right, covered very nicely in Chapter 1 of our text, American Government 3E. Elitism, right, and I want to articulate this in kind of two ways, right. Elitism can be a normative claim, right, kind of a value-driven claim that the elite should be running our politics by and large, right? And I don't want to be too hard on the Founding Fathers. They did many fantastic things. I'll give them their due in the next module. Quite brilliant in so many ways, right? But they were flesh and blood. They were just people. The Founding Fathers are a good example of a group of people that believed normatively in elitism, right? That America should be led by people like them, who they thought of as the best and the brightest, right? White men with economic and social power. So there's a normative argument that the elite should be running our government, shaping our politics most fundamentally. Our text does a nice job of capturing some of that. In terms of the makeup of Congress, right? Hardly a cross-section of the American people, and maybe we don't want it to be a cross-section of the American people, right? It's disproportionately representative of, especially, right, people with a great deal of economic power, money, and a lot of education from elite institutions on average. And we see that in other areas of our politics, right? Members of the U.S. Supreme Court, etc. But it can also be, right, a sort of an empirical claim that, maybe that's not the way it should be, but that's the way it is, right? That there's a certain reality to this argument, right? That whether you think it's good or bad, which is the normative question, you could argue that empirically it just is the case to a pretty high degree. Where you're not necessarily taking a value position on that fact, but just stating the fact as a fact of American politics. So there's that whole argument, kind of skepticism, at least on the normative side of that claim, right? Kind of a skepticism about the abilities of the ordinary citizen. They don't really have the capacity to govern well, and so we should leave it mostly to the elite. And again, that was definitely the view of the Founding Fathers. The alternative to that, as presented in our text, right, is pluralism, the argument that power both is and should be decentralized to groups made up of ordinary Americans, right? Because that's a way, we'll see, to sort of engage in politics is to join a group, right? Power in numbers. United we stand, divided we fall. So the pluralist argument is that people, ordinary Americans, join interest groups of all sorts, right? Some perhaps more liberal and progressive, others perhaps more conservative, and then everything in between, right? People join interest groups in order to maximize their political influence on politics, and that it's a relatively level playing field. And sometimes this group will win in a battle over power. Sometimes another group. Sometimes yet another group. That's a little naive, right? Don't we know in reality, we'll see later in the course that some interest groups are more equal than others. Some are more powerful than others. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, extremely powerful. Various nonprofit groups, right, typically a lot less powerful and influential. But, right, still, that would be part of that argument that people maximize their power and influence by joining groups. That's a way to decentralize power, right? Rather than having it concentrated among the elite, you disperse it among the many, the organized groups that people can join. And again, right, the argument might be normative, that's not only, you would argue normatively that that's a desirable state of affairs, to decentralize political power to the many via organized groups. Right, as sort of an alternative to elitism. Or you might simply make it, right, as kind of an empirical claim. This is simply the way things are. I'm not taking a value position. Right? A pluralist may argue, whether we like it or not, although typically pluralists will like it, but whether we like it or not, that's how political power works in a democracy. It's decentralized to groups that people can join. All right, so those are two sort of alternative ways of thinking about power in our constitutional democracy. Again, both the normative position on each of those as well as the empirical position on each of those. I mean, what's the reality? If those are the two schools of thought that we're looking at here, it's probably right, and I know this is kind of cliche, but it's kind of probably right, some of both, somewhere in the middle. That to some extent, right? It is true that economic and social elites in America have always had disproportionate power, rightly or wrongly. But it's also true, right, that ordinary people can help shape our politics as well, most particularly by joining interest groups to collectivize their power and maximize their influence. Another nifty section in our text, chapter 1, is our author's discussion of something that they call citizen engagement. Let's talk about that right now. Again, it's, I think, a foundation of a constitutional democracy here in America, or constitutional democracies more generically, wherever in the world it might be, right? Isn't that the core premise, right? The promise of a constitutional democracy is that we, the people, shape our politics, excuse me, in some really fundamental ways, right? Without that, you don't really have democracy. Citizen engagement. Number of ways, right, that citizens can exercise that power in a democracy. Yeah, we'll see that, right, in an autocracy, people are subjects of the government, right, to be moved around like pawns on a chessboard. But in a democracy, right, ideally, we the people are not subjects, we are citizens who actively govern ourselves. Number of ways to do that, right? Via voting, right, for elected representatives. That's a critical act of citizen engagement, isn't it, in a democracy? Rates of voter participation in America are not super fantastic. They're not terrible. They're not even bad. They're pretty okay, kind of mediocre. It's one of the many reasons we are not ranked as one of the world's better democracies. We're typically ranked right around 20th or 25th in the world. Not terrible. Not terrible at all. Pretty good, actually, but not fantastic either. Yeah, right. We have relatively low rates of voter participation. That voter participation tends to sort of peak in presidential election years, right, where more people get engaged and hyped by the stakes. We're electing the next president. I believe we've actually moved up in recent years, that rate of participation, to somewhere in the low to mid 60s. Not bad. Nearly 2/3 of us these days vote in presidential elections. I'll take that. But it is true that in other democracies you get significantly higher rates of participation. And then in midterm elections, right, where we're not electing the president, but just, quotation marks, just members of Congress and state legislatures and governors, or the election cycle that we'll have in 2026, there the rates drop quite a bit, right? Because the marginal voters who were motivated in 2024 by the fact that we're electing someone to the White House, they disappear in other election cycles like midterms. It typically drops to around, used to be 40%, now it's closer to 45%, sometimes even approaching 50%, which again is not terrible, but it's not great either. So we get kind of a mixed grade on citizen engagement via voting participation. It could be a whole lot worse than it is, but could certainly also be significantly better. A lot of reasons for that we'll get into later in the course. One can also, and we talked right about pluralism in the previous slide. This is really kind of a form of that, right? People can join a social movement. It might be Black Lives Matter. It might be the LGBTQ civil rights movement. It might be the MAGA, Make America Great Again movement. It might be gun rights movement kind of stuff, right? All sorts of movements. Some are more progressive, some are more conservative, and then everything in between, right? By joining a social movement, right, you can make a real difference. Collectivizing your power by joining like-minded people. And in fact, we'll see that that's how we've achieved progress over time on civil rights issues, is through social movements driven by ordinary Americans, right, getting engaged with these movements. So that can be a critical form of participation as well in a democracy by we the people. Other ways to do it, right, campaign donations. We all get hit up these days, don't we, prior to an election cycle through texts or emails or phone calls to make a donation to one side or the other, one candidate or the other. You can join an interest group like the NRA or the NAACP or the ACLU, lots of other acronyms there. You might get involved in social media debates. I'm not always entirely sure how effective those are as a form of participation, but a lot of us, right, do kind of get drawn into these debates on social media for sure. It's a jungle out there, people. Be careful. And then finally, I guess in conclusion here, I would just note that citizen participation in a democracy does require a certain level of education and engagement by ordinary Americans, and that's not always there, And that education doesn't have to be formal education, right? You can certainly educate yourself. But typically, right, before you get involved in politics, you should know something about what it's about. You should know something about the underlying issues, something about the candidates. That requires a certain amount of education and engagement, right? Willing to put yourself out there and try to make a difference when you may not make a difference, but you might. But you might. And sometimes those things are lacking, right? One or the other, or perhaps both. A lack of education or knowledge about the issues, um, or candidates, and perhaps an unwillingness to put yourself out there and take a chance at making a difference. To say, the hell with it. The hell with it all. I have more interesting things to do. So, all right. The third and final part of talking about American foundationalism is inegalitarianism, right? So we've talked about classical liberalism, we've talked about classical republicanism. Now I want to talk about inegalitarianism. We have a tradition here, right, in America. And look, every country is going to have its own tradition of inegalitarianism, and we'll talk here about the American version of that tradition. Right? It's not something that we are proud of, but it would be naive and problematic to not fully acknowledge it, right? Because history lives in us today. Right, there's no way to fully escape our past, and we need to acknowledge that. It does no good to pretend it didn't happen or to say, well, that was in the past, we're completely free of that. That's not real. That's not real. So, something we need to talk about. So we do have these various traditions. I'll just lay out some of them here. Some of these are covered in the book quite nicely, others not, at least not in this chapter, although I think they do come back to it in the chapter on civil rights. So we'll explore that more fully then, but we want to introduce it now. Number one, white women, right? White women. The founding fathers, we know, treated women as inferior in critical ways, as intellectually inferior, as temperamentally inferior, and not worthy of being given the right to vote. Right? So at the inception of the Republic, although the Constitution was silent on this issue, they did delegate voting to the states for the most part. And what all 13 states did at the beginning was to fence women out of the right to vote. Right? Women didn't get that right guaranteed until the early 20th century through a constitutional amendment. There's a famous line from a letter that Abigail Adams had written to her husband, John Adams, who at the time was headed to the convention in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution. And she said, don't remember, John, remember the ladies, right? Remember the ladies. And I guess the founders did remember the ladies, but not in a good way. They fenced them out of politics. How many women were at that convention? Obviously none at all. So we've got that tradition, right? And look, have women made a lot of progress since then? Absolutely, right? Gained the right to vote in the early 20th century. You get that so-called second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, right? Addressing issues like sexual harassment in the workplace, domestic violence, divorce law, inequality in wages and access to the workplace. And then a more modern version of that, perhaps, with the Me Too movement. Right, but ongoing questions about, are the genders genuinely equal today? Are they? And look, gender issues, we'll see, can extend as well, right, to issues that affect the LGBTQ community. Clearly a hot battleground these days. So there's a deep tradition there, right? And it's why we struggle with it today. A lot of progress, right, but work to be done, arguably. Number two, blacks. Boy, what could be more obvious than that, right? It is often said that America was born in original sin, and the apple that we bit, right, was the apple of slavery. That started in 1619 when the first black people from Africa were brought here to serve as slaves. And it's funny, at the beginning, slavery in America was not strongly racialized. You had some white slaves, you had some white indentured servants, you had some free blacks, you had indigenous slaves, you had free indigenous people. Slavery at inception was relatively fluid, but by the latter half of the 1600s, slavery as an institution, as an economic institution, a cultural institution, a political institution, it became increasingly and intensely racialized to apply only to black people. All right. And of course, by the founding in 1787, that was set in stone, and it gets built right into the Constitution. We'll talk about that in Chapter 2. So that's something that we still struggle with today. Now look, we do have a Civil War in 1860. The U.S. prevails in that war, defeats the treasonous Confederacy. The Southern states are brought back into the fold, and we expunge slavery through things like the 13th Amendment. And then we have Reconstruction. Right? But sadly and tragically, Reconstruction fails after about a dozen years. President Rutherford B. Hayes pulls the military out of the South, which had been enforcing things like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and other federal civil rights laws. And once the troops come out, all hell breaks loose, and the white South reasserts its authority over black people, and you get Jim Crow, right? Systematic deprivation of voting rights for black people, systematic segregation, systematic discrimination, systematic lynchings by the KKK. So that all falls apart, very sadly, and we go backwards with a vengeance. And then we revisit it, right, in the 50s and 60s through the Black Civil Rights Movement. And we do get landmark legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All right, and that's progress, no question. Right? Some call that our second Reconstruction, way more successful than our first one. But right, work to be done. We know that from the Black Lives Matter movement, that we have ongoing racial inequalities in all sorts of ways, in education, in employment, in income, access to health care, lifespan, all of these things, right, that we still struggle with, right? It's what we've inherited from our troubled past of inegalitarianism. Third, the indigenous peoples of America. That's quite a story. We'll tell more of it in the chapter on civil rights, right? But indigenous people. I think when white settlers first arrived here in small numbers, the indigenous people were, numerous and well organized and a force to be reckoned with. And in that sense, white people had a relatively positive view of indigenous people as a force to be reckoned with, as perhaps their equal even, right? But pretty quickly, the indigenous population was decimated primarily through the transmission of diseases from Europeans, for which the indigenous people had no immunity, so they got wiped out in massive numbers very quickly. And white people, right, from the West kept coming and coming and coming. I mean the Western Hemisphere, from Great Britain and some other European states. Right, so the power imbalance started to switch over time. And as white people became more numerous and indigenous people became less numerous, white people got increasingly contemptuous of indigenous people as inferior, right? Culturally inferior, intellectually inferior, religiously inferior, technologically inferior. So worthy of being treated badly in the pursuit of scarce resources as whites migrated west, right? And indigenous tribes got pushed west over and over and over and over again. And it's a harsh, brutal, terrible history. And by the late 19th century, the indigenous people had effectively been subjugated and moved west. And I think today indigenous people, amazing that they're still around, quite honestly, but they are still around indeed, have clung tenaciously. Here in America, about 1.5% of our population is indigenous. Some live on reservations, some don't. Some are strong members of tribes, others may be less so. But in many ways, if you look at basic measurements of quality of life, indigenous people as a group tend to be at or near the bottom of America's racial and ethnic hierarchy. So there's quite a story to be told there that we still struggle with today. All right. Religious minorities of all sorts, right? Jewish people, Mormons, Catholics, Yeah, people often forget this today, but Catholics used to be considered an invading horde from places like Ireland and Italy. They were looked upon contemptuously by native-born Protestants who saw them as an alien threat. So they faced systematic discrimination for many decades because of their religious identity. So there's that tradition as well, right? And we still struggle with it today to some degree. Now, we have become a lot more secular. Religion is no longer all that central for most people, so that's de-escalated the conflicts. But there are still some conflicts there that roil our politics from time to time. Japanese Americans, and I add these. The first, I think, three were covered well by our book. I threw in 4, 5, 6, and 7 as a non-comprehensive set of additions. Japanese Americans, think about their treatment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In what was that, 1941, I believe? About 100,000 Japanese Americans, 3/4 of them citizens here, were forcibly relocated to internment camps across the Mojave Desert for the most part in the American Southwest against their will. Had they done anything to warrant that? Hell no. Had done nothing other than being of Japanese descent. Right? The fear by the American people, white people basically, was that Japanese Americans, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, might be more loyal to the Japanese emperor than to America. And so preemptively, they were carted away. And it's a terrible chapter in our history. It's another example of our tradition of inegalitarianism. Chinese immigrants. It is estimated that about 90% of the labor force working on the Trans-Pacific Rail Line through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, this would have been immediately pre- and post-Civil War, so mid to late 19th century, was labor performed by Chinese immigrants, recruited here for that purpose. While they were building it, white Americans thought of them as an industrious, hardworking people. Once that line was completed through the Sierra Nevada, very dangerous work, a lot of people died. They used primitive technology, a lot of gunpowder, to blast tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. They were treated very hostilely, if that's even a word, treated with great hostility by white Americans who were like, okay, your work is done. Why are you still here? You people suck. Right? And that's why you end up with Chinatowns in places like San Francisco, Reno, San Diego, and so on. Right? It was a way for Chinese immigrants during this backlash after the building of the Trans-Pacific Rail Line to protect themselves by gathering together in community. So some of it was that, and some of it, right, was just plain old sort of segregationist policies by white people to make sure that Chinese immigrants lived in one part of the city and didn't sort of integrate with white people. I believe the Chinatown in Reno was ultimately burned to the ground by the government. Talk about hostility towards the Chinese immigrants. So that's another part of our inegalitarian tradition. And then finally, and I have a really good radio program there that you can click on if you're looking at the PowerPoint version of these slides. Mexican Americans in the American Southwest. Quite a history of inegalitarianism there. Related in part to the Mexican-American War and the results of that. So check that out. And what you have here, right, is a tradition in the American Southwest for many decades, and I think we struggle with it yet today, a history of discrimination, segregation, and even lynchings. All right, lynchings. Another part, right, of our inegalitarian tradition. Now, look, I'm high on America for the most part. But I think if we're going to be as good as we can be, we got to acknowledge our faults and address them forthrightly and not sort of cover them up and pretend it's all gone away and it's in the past and therefore not a problem. No, the past lives in us today, and we'll always struggle with that to some degree. But I think the important thing is that we struggle with it and come to grips with it in forthright fashion.